Mr. President, Mr. Auditor, ladies and gentlemen of the College Theological Society, I come to you as an atheist, as somebody who would never choose to have my children circumcised. What I want to talk about this evening is more the pragmatic argumentation with regard to this issue and how in reality prohibition is probably the most wrong-headed manner to go around disincentivising people from having circumcision performed in the first instance. And secondly, specifically feeds into historical repression of minority religious communities, specifically in the Western world. And in that regard, I think a legislative ban on circumcision is a particularly poor idea and is a very foolish way to go about thinking of this issue. Okay, so first of all I want to talk about principally the historical issues that we recognise and the specific reason for the outrage that was caused in Germany when this ban was originally mooted and in fact enacted. Michael was probably a bit misleading when he said that the German government bowed to religious pressure to eventually have this initial ban repealed. What they in fact bowed to was a liberal pressure, a pressure from Germans who are ashamed of their past, perhaps rightly so, perhaps who are indeed very progressive now, and who recognised that what that ban initially did was play into the hands of far-right neo-fascist groups within Germany who want to have the capacity to ostracise and want to have the capacity to make minority religious groups within Germany feel excluded from ordinary society. In that regard, we have to recognise that in the Western world, specifically when we recognise that the groups who are most likely to have circumcision performed for religious reasons are often some of the most marginalised groups in our society. When we recognise that, in terms of a majority, relatively ethnically homogenous Christian society in both Germany and indeed Ireland, circumcision is not something that's generally practiced by the vast majority of individuals, and so necessarily then, when you apply a ban on circumcision, it has primarily an effect on religious groups who are in a minority. In that sense, we have to look pragmatically at what this ban does to those groups, and secondly, how it can be used and seen as a stick to beat minority religious groups by neo-fascists, specifically in Germany in that regard. And that's why I specifically disagreed with that ban at the time, and I felt that the German government probably made the right decision in terms of respecting religious freedom of a group that had historically been repressed in that sense. In terms of the practical argumentation that's been made with regard to whether or not circumcision is harmful or isn't, I think that in general what we've probably seen is that it's probably a bit of a wash. There's advantages and disadvantages on both sides with regard to whether or not somebody is circumcised. There's a definite reduction in your chances of contracting HIV if you are circumcised. We also have to recognise that with regard to the rebuttal we heard from the proposition in terms of that not being necessary so long as you use condoms, recognise that religious groups are perhaps the individuals least likely to use condoms traditionally, and so that if there's a natural reality that circumcised males are less likely to contract HIV, and they also are uninclined to use condoms because they are from a very religious background, we must recognise that that's probably an advantage. But also in terms of whether or not there is a specific great harm to circumcision, whether or not it really affects sexual pleasure or your capacity to have a full and happy sex life in that regard. I point to the fact that in America, for primarily medical reasons, roughly half of the male population is circumcised, and has been since the 1950s. In that regard, to conflate it as being similar to female genital mutilation, or indeed child sacrifice as somebody made a point of information, it's just fantastical. I mean, we have to recognise and moderate our language to recognise what's actually occurring here and whether or not it really is as serious as what some of the proposition speakers have tried to make it out to be. I mean, yes, you can recognise that the child, that the child can't consent to this. We also recognise that in terms of many of the decisions that we invest parents with in regular childhood, the child can't consent to those either. We just recognise that in general, parents are the people in society best placed to make decisions for their children because naturally they know them best. More importantly, they know the community in which that child exists best. With specific regard to whether or not that child is going to be growing up in an ethno-religious community in the Western world, perhaps it is acceptable for those parents then to make a pragmatic decision and recognise that, look, this child is realistically going to be part of a religious community, they're going to marry into that community when they're older. It's realistically relatively reasonable for us to presume, in that situation, whether or not we can have this done, given that it is a relatively minor procedure and a painless procedure as well, once it's done by a qualified medical professional. In that regard, I want to talk about the pragmatic realities of what this will do. We recognise that traditional prohibition is perhaps the least intelligent manner to go about changing social practice, right? We recognise that historically when bans on circumcision have been enacted, what more often happens is that people have them done by less skilled or untrained people, which greatly increases the risk to children in that regard. And secondly, what it does is it incentivises particularly minority immigrant communities, particularly in Germany, to have circumcisions performed in their country of origin, where first of all it's more expensive because it can't be provided under any sort of social welfare system. Secondly, is often a way for the parents to feel that they are being alienated by a state they've immigrated to, that they are being disencouraged from existing or having an ordinary existence in that state. And I think when you recognise that very often there's a very hostile attitude towards minority religious communities in the West, that for governments to enact legislation that does specifically seem to influence just one particular set of religious communities, it's very harmful in that sense in terms of creating a dialogue whereby it seems that religious practice for these groups is considered unacceptable. In that sense, it feeds into a culture of racism, it feeds into a culture of ostracization, and in that sense I think it should be opposed as a ban, even if principally we think, and I don't necessarily agree, that circumcision is a terrible breach of human rights. In terms of how circumcision is performed and whether or not it's preferable for us to provide it in a safe environment. I think realistically, when you recognise that the safest way to provide circumcision is probably for free, probably in a hospital, with a consultant overseeing it in terms of, first of all, anaesthetic and aftercare, which is very important. And you recognise that if you're going to, on the proposition, characterise people who have circumcision performed as religious fanatics, do they in that situation then believe that these parents are realistically not going to have their child circumcised? Or are they just going to have their child circumcised anyway, but probably by somebody who's less qualified, and probably in a situation where aftercare won't be available to them because they'll be fearful of prosecution by the government in that sense? In that situation, it's much more likely that parents won't go to hospitals if there is a problem with a botched circumcision, because they feel like they'll be prosecuted and persecuted by the state in that sense. And so we magnify greatly the risks to the child in terms of a procedure that is generally completely safe, so long as it is provided by a qualified practitioner. In that sense, we recognise that a ban in this manner is particularly harmful and probably a particularly wrong-headed manner of going about this. I'll take Jamie. Go ahead.
If a religion required that newborns be pierced or tattooed, would you be in favour of that?
I think that's an irrelevant point. It's not like we can bandy about like the counterfactual all we want. We can bandy about notions of child sacrifice that was mentioned by the proposition. What I'm talking about and what I specifically want to address here are the pragmatic realities of how religious communities operate within the Western world, especially given that they're often a minority. I think if you want to say, would I support it if a specific religion like insisted that like a child's limbs be hacked off? It's not relevant to the debate we're having a specific debate about a specific procedure that, when performed by a qualified medical professional, is relatively safe. And in that sense, I think the harms for banning it outweigh the benefits. I'll take the gentleman in front.
Yeah, I mean, if you support the right to circumcise baby boys, but you're against the mutilation of baby girls, which is a very real procedure, which is illegal but still exists.
Yeah.
Aren't the people? I mean, doesn't it weaken our case against female genital mutilation? Won't people just think that we're hypocrites for allowing certain minorities who want to protect to mutilate, and I think that is an appropriate word, their sons, but at the same time we ban people from mutilating their daughters? That just sounds like hypocrisy to me. We should protect all babies of both sexes.
I think when you're looking at legislation and how we enact it, is that it's always a question of a comparative about where the harms really lie. I think we all recognise that female genital mutilation is, first of all, a much more harmful procedure. A procedure that causes excruciating pain for young girls whenever they urinate for like their entire childhood, and so in that sense, significantly more wrongful and significantly more harmful to the individual's well-being than male circumcision is on a comparative. So it's a simple question in that regard of which we consider to be a more egregious harm. In the same way that we moderate any policy with regard to the circumstances of the individual, and with regard to whether or not we legislate harshly in that regard, there's a reason why there is a distinction between gross assault and less so. I mean, all you're saying is, do you think we should have different legislations for different laws for different levels of harm occurred to the individual? Yes, that's what our current status quo is. All you're saying is that yes, there's a particularly egregious and worse version of this. Do you think that we should ban it? Yeah, I do. But I think in terms of a specific argument for whether or not male circumcision exists, the existence of female circumcision doesn't really have an impact on that. For those reasons, I beg your pardon. Thank you.